Okay, well, good morning. My name is Estelle Parker. I'm the Executive Manager at Responsible Investment Association Australasia. We're presenting to you today from the RIA offices on Rowntree country, and I'd like to pay my respects to those who've looked after these lands and waters and all of the lands and waters of those who are joining us today, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Kia ora also to our New Zealand participants who are dialing in from Aotearoa this morning. Well, this is a second of 4 workshops that are brought to you by RIA in association with the Australian government. So I'd like to thank Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water for their amazing support in putting on these sessions. Through these sessions, we really want corporate entities in a broad range of sectors to have the knowledge and to really understand how to use TNFD as a framework. And we now have version 0.4, so there's further piloting work that will need to be done before the final framework is released in September. So we'd like to encourage you to consider piloting. And there are many organisations out there that are there to help you pilot, many of whom are joining us in this workshop today. So in the end, really, this is about incorporating nature into mainstream risk management and reporting processes. So today, we are going to hear an update on what's new in version 0.4. We're going to hear about 2 pilots, one on mining and metals and another on the infrastructure construction sector. We're going to learn about the TNFD's LEAP framework in some detail. So please put your questions through the Q&A function. And we'll spend the last half hour or so of this workshop doing some practical work in breakout rooms. So thank you very much to all of our facilitators who are joining us today from EY, Pollination, Deloitte, KPMG and PwC for providing your expertise to our breakout rooms. So the 4th iteration of the beta framework was released less than 48 hours ago. And here to take us through some of the major changes, some of the enhancements and so on, and additional guidance that's contained in this framework version is a Taskforce member, Guy Williams. He's director in Deloitte's risk advisory practice. He's supporting clients to develop science-based solutions to existing and emerging biodiversity challenges. He's an expert in natural capital and has spent over 20 years in research in landscape ecology. And we at RIA are also honoured to have Guy as a co-chair of RIA's Nature Working Group. So over to you first off. Thank you very much, Guy. I think Guy's going to do a screen share of his slides.
Yeah, thanks so much, Estelle. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Just give me one moment to bring up my slides. Wonderful. I'd also like to commence by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we all join from today. For me, this is the Kin people of northern Vietnam. I want to acknowledge their ongoing connection to land, rivers, oceans, and recognise that these people as the original ongoing custodians of nature. As Estelle has mentioned, version 0.4, the final and by far the largest release of the TNFD beta framework has now been released. There's a lot of content out there, and so we're not going to be able to do full justice to introducing all of the intricacies and details of this release in this time that we've got today. But I'm going to hopefully just give you a chance to see what has been released and help you to navigate where you can access information as relevant to you and your various interests and steps within working through the TNFD process. This material will also be available for you. It's a material that was shared via a series of official TNFD Secretariat webinars over the last couple of days. So this content is all yours to access and use as best suits. And obviously, please get in touch with myself, RIA, or any of the other speakers today if you want more information in navigating through the TNFD version 0.4 release. So this material for some of you may be very familiar if you've joined any of those webinars. So apologies for any repetition. But just this kind of real key headline that the amount of feedback that's been received by the TNFD to go into this version 0.4 has been immense. And hopefully a lot of what you're seeing is actually in response to feedback that you may have provided or what you may see as being really useful. So the TNFD itself has grown significantly, now over 1,000 forum members. A huge amount of feedback on the feedback, which has kind of come through, both written feedback and various other views and comments. And obviously a huge number of organizations that are now actively piloting the feedback, the framework. And that's also a really core important part of what's gone into developing where we are now. So this is just a quick navigation of some of the three most core parts of the TNFD framework itself. These were all in some form already there before version 0.4. We're going to be spending a lot of time later today to discuss in more detail the nature-related issues or the nature-related assessment framework or LEAP. The recommended disclosures has gone through some further revisions, some tweaking and changes around that. And probably one of the most substantial new additions is the additional guidance. That's additional technical guidance for both sectors and for biomes, as well as some additional guidance on scenarios and stakeholder guidance, which has been released. So just really quickly, this was, I thought, a really effective slide that was released with version 0.4, just to show that we're seeing an increasingly diverse range of users interested in the TNFD framework itself. And this includes those core report preparers, those companies and financial institutions that are now preparing or considering preparing disclosures in line with the TNFD. These are what you can see here in blue, those large multinational corporations, financial institutions. But also of huge interest is also those other actors within the value chains of these financial flows that are going to be responsible for or are interested in preparing information or contributing information into these broader disclosures. So you can see here in this larger circle, a large number of small, medium enterprises and other institutions that are also interested in understanding nature risks as related to them and to their various stakeholders. And so in particular, the LEAP framework is proving a really useful tool, even if they're not themselves having to prepare disclosures, but in terms of how they consider the opportunities and certainly managing the risks associated with nature. Another really useful figure, I believe, that kind of came out was actually showing how over the last 3 to 6 months with the rapidly evolving landscape of nature in terms of global frameworks and reporting standards, where TNFD sits in. One of the most common questions that we receive on the TNFD is how does it compare to other existing and emerging initiatives such as the Science-Based Targets Network? How does it align certainly with the TCFD in terms of those organizations looking to prepare both aligned TCFD and TNFD disclosures? And certainly, how does it sit within the evolving landscape of integrated reporting? So you can see here that the TNFD aims or seeks to sit very much within that framework to align with, as has always been the intent as a framework, to align with existing standards and to make sure that it builds upon work that's happening at the moment. So the organizations such as GRI, ISSB, IFRS, and the Science-Based Targets Network are core knowledge partners of the TNFD. And so the conversations are active and ongoing to make sure that any material that's released, as you'll see with version 0.4, does align with these existing reporting standards and frameworks. So this is just this is a snapshot. This is kind of what's come out with version 0.4. And as we've said, there's a lot that's come out. Certainly some updates to the recommended disclosures, and I'll cover that in a moment. A slight amendment to both the structure and the language of the disclosures. Additional changes to the LEAP approach in terms of additional assessment guidance, in terms of how information can be accessible as people work through that LEAP process. The additional sector and biome guidance, which is where most of my effort's been over the last 3 to 6 months, coordinating both the sector and biome guidance, and certainly where most of the anticipation and interest is in terms of how do we measure and assess. So those metrics, those disclosure and assessment metrics, what's being put forward as core required and additional recommended metrics to help organizations measure from both a comparability and flexibility perspective. So these all relate to various different parts of the TNFD architecture and have all been included. So I'm going to move through this really quickly, but this is just helping you to navigate where the main changes are. So in particular, in terms of the recommended disclosures, there's been a revision from 15 disclosure requirements in version 0.3 down to 14, which is where it's landed in this final release. The additional set of metrics have been actually kind of baked into this. So now as you go through the framework portal itself, through the different parts of the disclosure requirements, you'll be able to see where these various different core metrics sit within your different parts of the disclosure requirements. And also some tweaking of the language to even align it even further with the TCFD to make sure that those organizations that have building upon existing TCFD disclosures can see a very familiar set of disclosure requirements. In terms of changes to the LEAP framework itself, there's some additional scoping guidance, which is really important in terms of how both financial institutions in particular, but also corporates, how they can understand how they can access the LEAP process. So it's always been a little bit of a choose your own adventure, the LEAP process, an expectation that different organizations will access is at various different steps and points throughout the process. But there is some additional information in terms of how institutions can use and access the LEAP process, as well as some additional guidance around methods, risk assessment process, and as I've mentioned, the additional sector guidance, which also complements the LEAP process. Emma Hurd will give an introduction to the LEAP process and give a little bit more of an overview of how that's looking later on today, which is really exciting. So the big one where there's been most anticipation and certainly most response in the time since the release in the last 48 hours has been in terms of where we've landed on metrics. And so this figure I think is extremely useful to show that there's a number of different sets of metrics that is being proposed and released in this version and will continue to be updated through to a version 1.0. There are the core disclosure metrics, and these are the metrics that are expected of all organizations for them to align with and to prepare disclosures in line with the TNFD will seek to comply with, irregardless of your sector, the nature of your role within an organization and geography. There's also a set of additional disclosure metrics, which is more relevant to both the sector and biome context in which you sit. And they're the kind of the strongly encouraged, recommended metrics which you should use when you're starting to prepare your disclosures. And then there's a whole other larger bank which relates to just to the use and the application of the LEAP process, additional assessment metrics that organizations may be using as they work through their LEAP process. So just really quickly, the development of the metrics has gone from an exercise of over 3,000 metrics which have been put into the pot, a huge number actually that particular working group has worked through, and they've then synthesized, revised, sought a huge amount of both industry and knowledge partner scientific feedback to come up with a core and recommended set of metrics that meets these key criteria. That it clearly balances the complexity of nature and of science with practical constraints and providing useful, usable information, is comparable by report users both across different sectors, but also those working within the same landscape, so that even if you're from a different sector, you can also provide meaningful comparisons. Flexibility, so giving report preparers the ability to still have some level of choice based on what's relevant and useful and practical for them, as well as obviously the opportunity to align with emerging global policy goals, including the global biodiversity framework. So that's where some of the last revisions have gone into the selection of the metrics. I'll cover this one really quickly, but it's also just making it clear that the selection of these metrics is also sought to align specifically with the LEAP process. So there are individual metrics that covered various different steps within the LEAP process, as well as these core disclosure metrics, which are certainly obviously relevant for the prepare phase, as organizations select which metrics they're going to be using for preparing their disclosures. So here's the final list. And as I said, this may be where many of you want to spend all of the conversation today, but it's where we're going to spend none of the conversation today. And we can certainly take questions in a moment. But just to let you know, what we've landed at is 10 core impact and dependency metrics, highlighting certainly that climate change and reporting on scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions is included within the set of core metrics. Climate is a core part of nature, not separate from. And so there's a great benefit in organizations using the TCFD as a platform to build out for TNFD, as well as these other impact metrics. There's also a series of 5 additional risk and opportunity metrics, which are seen as being really important as organizations start to measure both their efforts to manage risk and to identify opportunity within their value chain. So just in wrapping up, the other really big change was the additional guidance specifically around sectors and biomes. So within that, there's 4 core sectors which have been received quite extensive treatment or attention. These 4 core sectors are agriculture and food, energy, which includes both oil and gas, utilities and renewables, mining and metals and financial institutions, but also for those who sit in sectors outside, never fear, we have stood up additional working groups and they're actively working in preparing guidance which will feed into the framework on 5 additional sectors: forestry, aquaculture and fisheries, infrastructure and real estate, which I know is relevant to many of you on this call today, textiles and apparel, which actually sits within a broader consumer goods working group, and chemicals and pharmaceuticals. So those working groups will actually be providing additional guidance which will be fed into the framework between now and version 1.0. And the TNFD Secretariat will give you that notice when those additional updates to the framework come through. If you sit in a sector outside of this list, TNFD is still very material and very relevant for you. Nature is largely sector agnostic and applies to all sectors. And there is an expectation that you will look at the core or the general cross-specific information. And there's also an opportunity to build in additional sector guidance. There's also there's been a lot of requests for support around the concept of biomes and some of the technical aspects. So the ICMM global ecosystem typology has been used to define specific information on certain biomes. And there's a large number of different biomes within that typology. But the 4 core ones that have received specific guidance is tropical forests, rivers and streams, marine shelf, and intensive land use systems. And certainly all of those have some strong relevance for us here in Australia and New Zealand. So there's some great information there. What's come out in that guidance is a combination of additional concepts and definitions, specific guidance in terms of how the LEAP process can be applied for your sector or biome, some draft assessment metrics and recommended disclosure metrics. As I mentioned, those additional sector-specific metrics that may be relevant. And that's where a lot of what we call the biodiversity or the state of nature metrics kind of sit, because they are quite biome and sector-specific, as well as some additional information on business activities and the illustrative types of risks relevant for different sectors. So this is my last but one slide, is just to show you how you can access information. A number of you will be expecting to see sector PDFs or reports that are relevant to your information coming out. But actually the sector guidance and the biome guidance is being released in a very different platform. It's being actually released through the framework itself. So don't expect to see an infrastructure and real estate PDF ready to go with all of that information. It's going to involve you digging into the framework itself through the TNFD framework portal. There's a really fantastic dashboard and preferences function where you can go in there and you can select those sectors and those biomes that are most material or relevant or of interest to you. And once you've set up those preferences, they can then be saved within a unique profile for your use within the framework. And then as you work through the various different steps of the framework, of the LEAP process and of the disclosure requirements, you'll get clearly marked where there is additional sector guidance based on your preference or additional biome guidance based on your preference. And we believe that this kind of intuitive stepwise process where the information is fed to you as you need it is a really great way to receive the guidance, as opposed to bombarding or overwhelming people with too much information up front. So as I was mentioning before, that additional guidance that's going to come through for sectors and biomes will be fed into the framework. And this will be flagged, as you can see on the right of your screen there, with a new addition note, so you can see where that kind of new guidance is coming through. There's also, as I mentioned, some additional guidance on stakeholder engagement and affected stakeholders, which is critically important. And I'm not going to run over this because it's not important, but just highlighting that information has also been released, as well as some additional guidance on scenarios. For scenarios, probably the most exciting part for us is that it's really a direct feedback from that pilot testing of a number of companies that have been considering what these future nature-related scenarios can look like, including Reckitt, Dow, Kirin, and our own for us here in Australia and New Zealand, Stockland. So that's really exciting to see Stockland's work being featured really heavily within that kind of official pilot feedback to the development of scenarios. So just in wrapping up, feedback is now very much open, very much welcome. We're expecting that to come through. RIA in their role as a national consultation representative for Australia and New Zealand of the TNFD will play a really key role in coordinating a lot of that feedback. There's obviously ongoing technical development work to revise based on feedback and to provide that additional guidance I was speaking about. As well as some additional research on some of the data. We've obviously spoken a lot and previously around the data challenge and the data needs for solutions. That's ongoing and hasn't been missed in this release. It's just something where there's additional work that will be going to support and complement as you work through the framework where you can access some of those data solutions. And obviously all preparations, and after probably a short pause and a short break from the TNFD Taskforce itself to recover from this release, we'll then be moving very quickly towards version 1.0 release. So that's my whistle-stop tour. Thank you, Estelle. Back to you.
Indeed, thank you, Guy. And yes, you all certainly just deserve a break. Congratulations to everyone involved. This really is it's the final draft of all the core elements of TNFD that have come together. So it's really the first time I think that we've been able to see the whole thing. We've got the metrics, the target setting guidance, sector biome guidance, and so on. And while there's more sector guidance in development, essentially all the core elements are now there. Now, if you have questions for Guy, please put them in the chat function and we will hopefully have time for some questions later on. But we'll move right along now to Justin Rowntree to talk about some mining pilots that have been happening. Justin is an expert in mining and environment, sustainability and social performance. He has over 18 years experience on research projects internationally, and he works with the International Council on Mining and Metals. So thanks so much, Justin.
Thank you, Estelle. Appreciate the introduction there. And thanks to all of the RIA team for inviting me to present today and for organising this important event. I very much hope that the information that we all received today really helps lift our collective capacity on the importance of nature-related disclosures. But before I proceed any further, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you today from the lands of the Kaurna people, who are the traditional owners and custodians of the Adelaide Plains area in South Australia, where I live and work. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. If you don't mind going to the next slide, Bryony. A quick overview of the agenda so you know and have a bit of clarity on where I'm headed today. Is first I'll set the scene of who ICMM is and how we're thinking about our role in contributing to a positive state of nature. It's a bit of a diversion, but it does have a linkage to TNFD, which I think is quite important. I'll give you an overview of ICMM's role with TNFD and our approach that we've been taking with our mining and metals sector piloting. And then I'll share with you some of the early feedback relating to some of the emerging challenges and how we're thinking about overcoming some of those challenges. So on to the next slide, please. The International Council of Mining and Metals, ICMM, sorry, the next one again. Might have gone there. Yep, there we go. Yep, so the International Council of Mining and Metals, ICMM, is a leadership organisation working towards a safe, just and sustainable world enabled by responsibly produced minerals and metals. Our membership includes 26 global mining companies, as you can see on this slide, and this actually represents around about 1/3 of the global mining industry, so it's quite a lot. Now, I make this point, and I think it's quite important that when this collective group chooses to make sustainability-related commitments, it often carries with it some critical mass. And what we often see is that there's further adoption of these commitments and approaches right across the wider mining and metals sector. If you don't mind, onto the next slide. The way ICMM members look to strengthen sustainability performance is primarily through member conformance to ICMM's responsible mining principles, of which there are 10 along the top there, and the 39 associated performance expectations within them that are more or less the conformance expectations of that membership. Now, while these mining principles and performance expectations already recognise the importance of protecting nature, we also recognise that our level of ambition relating to nature doesn't go as far as it could. So this year, we're currently working really hard to strengthen our commitment on nature, which will be released later in the year, and it will likely have a very strong alignment with the Global Biodiversity Framework and have some pretty specific and concrete actions. And the reason that I wanted to share this with you is just to give you a bit of comfort that in parallel to the development of the TNFD framework, there's a significant portion of the mining and metals sector that's already thinking about and is committed to improving the state of nature. So this might dovetail quite well with the official launch of the TNFD framework later in the year. In the past, ICMM members have also made commitments to report against specific disclosure frameworks, such as GRI, which is a commitment of membership, and more recently disclosure in line with the TCFD. So it's not a stretch to think that a commitment to the adoption of TNFD by ICMM members is out of the question. But with that being said, there's certainly some work to be done to align our members on that approach. And so now I'll move on to the next slide on specifically about TNFD. Sorry, the next one again. We've been involved with TNFD since September 2022, and we have two official roles. The first of those roles is that we are the official piloting partner for the mining and metals sector. And the second of our roles is that we're responsible for developing the mining and metals sector specific guidance. From our perspective, piloting is a really particularly important for providing a set of information that we can use to improve both the main framework, but more importantly, to inform the development of the mining and metals sector specific guidance and ensure that the process is suitably intuitive and can be navigated right across our sector, irrespective of the size of your company or the commodities that you mine. The next slide, please. Now, while TNFD came to ICMM in September, we only really kicked off our piloting program in earnest in January this year. And as such, we only really have a relatively early set of insights to share with you. But like most sectors that I've spoken to, knowing where to start was a bit of an overwhelming activity. And so we devised this relatively simple strategy that focused on the four areas that you see there. And the first of those was scoping our piloting program. So scoping was critically important to ensure that we had appropriate coverage across a range of different commodities, a range of different geographies, that we considered the various methods for mining. We were also considerate of some of the really unique aspects of mining and its interface with nature, such as tailings management, for example. We wanted to include various mine life cycles and the various parts of our fairly unique value chains. Secondly, we then wanted to recruit enough piloting participants that we could test the TNFD framework right across the depth and breadth of that scope that I just mentioned. And finally, we've set up a cadence of meetings with our piloting participants, and they occur nominally monthly. And that's really about supporting the sharing of challenges among our piloting participants, and also using that forum as to get the collective knowledge of that group to develop some of the tools that will go into the sector-specific guidance. On to the next slide. I'll now give you an overview of where we're at after our first 3 months of piloting. We have 12 companies piloting the TNFD framework, as you can see in this slide. 10 of those are ICMM members, and 2 of them are not. Those that aren't are ArcelorMittal and Hindustan Zinc. All of these companies are at various stages of maturity in their TNFD piloting journey. Many of them, or most of them in fact, typically start off with doing more or less a corporate gap assessment to look at what does their corporate governance currently do versus what does the TNFD framework look like, to see what is the gap that they might need to fill to get up to spec. 2 of our piloting participants well and truly into the depth of a full leap process at their specific mining assets. And then there's a large number of our piloting participants that are in the throes of contracting third parties to support them with a detailed leap assessment. We have piloting representation across a range of geographies and latitudes. We've got pilotings, I think, in all continents with the exception of North America and Antarctica. So really good representation of geographies and biomes. We've got a good range of commodities included there. So we've got iron ore and steel production. We've got copper, we've got zinc, metallurgical coal, gold and bauxite. And we've also got some representation of a couple of phases of the mining life cycle. So we've got a couple of projects that are running an assessment on an early phase project development of some large mining sites. And we've also got a lot of operating mines that are running assessments. So now I'll move into some of the challenges and learnings that have emerged in our 3 months of piloting. In many cases, we've actually identified the challenges, but we don't yet have the solutions. And so this is, continues to be a bit of a work in progress. Unfortunately, I won't be able to cover off on all of these challenges right now, but I might look to create a forum because I'd love to gain the perspectives of some of this group on, what they think of these challenges, and maybe they might have some ideas of how we might best overcome these ourselves. So firstly, there's really good consensus amongst the mining and metals piloting participants that the TNFD framework is really well intended. There's nothing quite like it in the mining and metals space. It's generally well supported. However, like any new concepts and frameworks, especially with the inherent complexities of trying to measure nature, there's still some challenges that will need to be overcome and navigated in our sector. One of the key areas that we've focused on so far is around getting started. And what we've found is that the first impressions of our piloting participants, when they start familiarising themselves with the online TNFD portal, is that it can be quite overwhelming. And it feels like a bit of a Pandora's box of kind of clickable requirements and ancillary guidance. And sometimes you're just never quite sure whether you've seen all the relevant information. So this has been a bit of a cause of some head scratching and wheel spin. But I think this has probably partly been overcome in version 0.4. And I can see that there's a front-end screening tool that's been added that really refines the list of information for specific sectors and user interests. But that being said, we really want to ensure that we have an easy entry point for anyone in the sector, whether you have multiple assets or a single mining asset. So what we see would be quite useful when we develop the sector guidance is some really simple flow charts. Are you a single asset owner, or are you a multi-asset owner? Then what, then what, then what? So we think it would be really useful to use some common sector language and some signposting around what are the really useful and informative tools that we've found for our sector among the myriad of tools that are currently listed in the TNFD framework. And we'll also have some really illustrative examples and pro formas. I'll touch on the locate phase, which is another area that we've been focused on. Some common feedback that we're getting when it comes to locate, in particular L1 around identifying our physical footprint. And it is a choose your own adventure, but our piloting participants can sometimes be quite systematic about really wanting to tick off all of the information. And if sometimes it reads the L1 phase, defining your physical footprint can be quite prescriptive. If we're just defining the physical footprint of our mining assets, that doesn't necessarily cover the full scope of our interaction with nature. As we know, for mining, for example, our assets, our interface with nature does extend well beyond our physical assets themselves. For example, we might have a groundwater drawdown contour which extends tens of kilometres away, or when we develop a new site, we create access for communities, and that can have a cumulative and increased pressure on the surrounding nature. So for piloting, some of our companies are setting boundaries of 50 kilometres around their physical assets to account for these factors. But we think it would be really useful in this phase and in our sector guidance to help set some, some guidance around setting an area of influence to take into consideration some of those broader impacts on nature, which would typically otherwise be addressed in both the evaluate and assess phase. One other common bit of feedback that we're getting is around the difficulty that a lot of the piloting participants are having in identifying the location of all the aspects of their value chains. Some mining companies, you look at something like a Glencore or a Vale, they might have 10 to 15,000 suppliers in their value chain. So the feedback that we're receiving is that it's extraordinarily time consuming and really difficult to locate these companies in the value chain, let alone look at their impacts and dependencies. So to get some insights on how we might deal with this in our sector, we're looking towards our climate teams and also our modern slavery teams, who are quite adept and proficient within our sector at unpacking the value chain. So that's probably a bit of encouragement to others too, is if you are finding that hard, that those teams typically have a good appreciation through looking at Scope 3 emissions and modern slavery. We're also looking at a number of the available platforms, and some that look good to us are things like Trace, MineSpider and Fair Supplier. They've got some really good platforms that really efficiently help us assess the risks and impacts in our value chain. And we're also looking to develop somewhat of a maturity framework to identify the priority areas of our value chain that we might focus on first when we extend out our TNFD assessments. Now, one of the last challenges I might just mention is that's probably worth bringing to your attention, and this more so sits in the evaluate and assess phase, which we haven't covered in great detail, but some of the kind of external metrics that are coming out relating to nature, such as those of the science-based target networks, which require no conversion of natural land to be compliant. And you can see in this map, the green areas in that map represents the natural land that shouldn't be converted. But because of this huge scope of natural lands, it's very hard for the mining and metals sector to be compliant with that. And the reason for this is that the location of economic ore bodies, including most energy transition metals, are really rare, and they're quite indiscriminate to where they occur. So if we're to meet the global climate goals, which are obviously strongly linked to our nature goals, we'll need to be opening quite a few more mines between now and 2030 and 2050. And you may have seen some statistics from the World Bank that we need 500% more copper by 2050 to meet global climate goals. So this, if we can't convert in any part of this green areas, that might be a real challenge. And so that's something that we need to really carefully consider and form part of our ongoing consultation. So in closing, I'll note that ICMM are really regularly involved in a number of new and emerging disclosure frameworks, and we're typically brought in at the end of that phase where we can't have a great impact. But what TNFD have done through this really deep and stratified and extraordinarily consultation process is really outstanding. And I believe that TNFD have a really good chance of developing this framework that has really great and broad adoption. And hopefully with this adoption, it improves the state of nature, and hopefully it even accelerates our progress towards the global biodiversity framework. I'll leave it there, Estelle. Hopefully I haven't gone too much over our 15 minutes.
Thanks so much, Justin. That's really insightful and some really good advice there on engaging, for example, your modern slavery reporting teams to identify the value chain and the various resources that are available. I'll move along now to Paul O'Connell, who is going to speak with us about Acciona's pilot of TNFD. He's an experienced environment and sustainability manager with over 14 years experience in the private and public infrastructure and construction sectors. He's currently Acciona's Group Manager for Health, Safety, Environment, Quality and Sustainability. Thanks very much, Paul.
Thanks, Estelle. think you can see my screen there. Thanks and good morning, everyone. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak today. I want to share with you our TNFD piloting experience in infrastructure, including sharing some of the challenges and also opportunities. We use version 0.3 and applied the LEAP process. I also need to acknowledge our friends at EY, who are our partners in the trial in terms of developing the methodology and reporting outputs. In terms of Acciona, we're a renewable energy and infrastructure company. We operate globally and operate in many sectors. We're a TNFD working group member, and we're really keen on the framework to get a better understanding and application of our reporting, our risks and opportunities, but also reporting and disclosure of those nature-related risks. Where we started, well, it was really about understanding the importance of nature and our dependence on it. Certainly a big part of what, why we're involved is to improve our capabilities and standards in terms of how we measure and increase investment indicators, focusing on biodiversity loss. We're certainly dependent on raw materials, through our infrastructure projects. Our supply chain generates huge impacts. We have over 65,000 suppliers. And it's also, really important that we understand, what are the opportunities and also understand the real cost to do business. So in terms of how we applied the framework, to this end, we selected 4 representative activities of the company. They were based on a water project, a desal project, a construction site, a solar farm, and also a wind farm development. And the methodology approach was, whilst there was some lack of guidance, we used the LEAP approach proposed by TNFD. In terms of the locate, we looked at the business footprint and the projects. The solar PV project was in Spain, the wind farm in South Africa, the desal plant in South America, and an infrastructure project here in Australia in Perth, the Bunbury Outer Ring Road project. So in terms of the nature interface, we looked at the different types of ecosystems that each of the projects interface with, and the prioritisation of those, what level of biodiversity value and the level of water stress, and also the sector identification in terms of the business and the value chain. EY supported us in terms of the tools used through QGIS and ArcGIS and other open source data, and that was overlaid over the sites to obtain some specific eco-regional data for each project. And we also used the Encore to assist in the classification of the sectors and sub-industries. Then we applied 10 external and nature-related data layers such as tree loss, water risk, key biodiversity areas. And they were prioritised based on the spatial analysis, the intersection of Acciona's assets with those, and then they were scored in terms of their expected pressures on nature. As a result, no surprises there. The infrastructure or construction of an infrastructure project generates a wider pressure on biodiversity, so more effort there on getting more specific data required for the evaluation of those. And we need a better understanding of our dependencies, based on each of the sectors as well. Before evaluating the impacts, we looked at the potential material impacts at a sector level, and then we evaluated looking at the dependencies and impacts, including the impact pathways, the current state of nature, the changes to the state of nature, and the pressure and response. And we conducted that dependency analysis for each location, looking at the state of nature. We mainly got the information from impact assessments, which are available for each of the projects and other open source data to help identify the KPIs in relation to each of those aspects. Water, for example, if it was in a water stressed area, we got pressure details from Encore database, and response about was informed by the existence of management plans and current controls in place. Certainly that, we face some challenges in this space, in terms of the limitations. It's not as well defined in this particular phase, and the supply chain's certainly a real challenge. But the results of this, in order to compare the impact of the 4 activities, we quantify the total number of the impacts associated with each of the 4 pilot projects. And the Bunbury Outer Ring Road has been one that generates the greatest pressure in nature. But as I mentioned, there were some limitations in the maturity of the tools. There were some gaps in data availability and accuracy, but that is a complicated phase, and we're looking at reviewing this methodology and findings a little bit further. And then in terms of assessing the risks as contractors, we do focus a bit on risk. So this was familiar territory. In terms of the risk identification, we based it on categories like physical risks, transition risks like policy or legal, market and technology. We looked at the value chain upstream and direct, and the level of monitoring happening at a corporate or site level. The probability, we used some scenarios and expert opinions and sector information as well. And we also put some questionnaires out to the sites and country managers in those areas. And then the risk exposure was just calculated by the probability by severity. And financial risk was taken into account in order to estimate the cost of those risks. And then we developed a bit of a heat map to plot those to help better define the measures to manage those risks. And the objectives here were really, to identify prioritisation of the key risks, but also looking at the opportunities. But we were limited in some of the scenarios available, and also there were some challenges of turning some of these results into financial risks as well. In terms of preparing the disclosures phase, the objectives here are really, we gathered the results of the previous phases and applied the 15 recommendations in the TNFD categories: governance, strategy, risk, and metrics and targets. There was some limited guidance here, and I don't think we did it 100% the way it was intended, but the overall objectives was to help define strategy and resource allocations to help decision making in these areas. And I think overall, the application, we certainly see some real advantages and multiple opportunities that come out of it in better understanding risk and opportunities. There are some opportunities for improvement to better align, particularly for us, taking out the opportunity to improve data quality to better align with TNFD, reduce our dependencies and impacts. We need more comprehensive mitigation and offset measures, and also voluntary restoration on top of that, those offsetting, and then also strengthening our risk assessment and analysis to build in that awareness in our processes amongst our projects, but also through to board level as well. And then we want to, of course, utilise the reporting and implementation of that to really strengthen the procedures around nature-related issues throughout the company. So that's a bit of a deeper dive into our pilot. Thanks for the opportunity.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Paul. That was really fantastic, illuminating, and I think really interesting points about, for example, the use of open source data and so on, and that sort of where you can learn from piloting the framework to really prepare yourselves for the release of 1.0 in September. And really great to hear how Acciona went about using the LEAP framework as well from an infrastructure perspective. which we will now hear more about from Emma Hurd, who is an EY Oceania Climate Change and Sustainability Partner. She has 20 years experience in climate change and sustainability practice and also in the finance sector. So I hand over to you now, Emma, to take us through LEAP.
Thanks very much, Estelle, and thanks very much to Ria for hosting this session today. Incredibly timely to both digest the results of the new framework or the expanded framework, also to really begin to unpack and learn from some of the insights of the piloting projects that are underway in terms of putting some meat on the bones of the LEAP framework as well. So I'm in a pretty privileged position in terms of my comments and contributions to the workshop today, in that I am perfectly sandwiched in between some detailed analysis around the new framework and some of the pilot processes, and then also the opportunity after this to actually then break into smaller groups and actually begin to unpack and digest some of these questions as well. And in that, I also just wanted to acknowledge that I'm really pleased and proud to be supported by the rest of the team, including Alex Banks, who's my partner, who's also been leading a lot of the piloting work as well, a partner in my team, I should say, not my partner, as well as Miguel, Emily, Ross and Rena as well, who will be helping to facilitate the sessions, along with a number of other really key experts as well. So I think it's also really interesting in terms of some of the common themes and lessons learned that are coming through the piloting process in terms of applying the LEAP framework, because there really does seem to be some consistent points of agreement in the practicalities of it, as well as in the feedback that's gone into version 0.4 and is now reflected in this version of it as well, which we're all digesting. So before I start, I also just want to take a moment to acknowledge that I'm joining you from the lands of the Gadigal of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land, and also pay my respects to the elders, the knowledge holders and leaders, both past and present, who are such a key part of this discussion in terms of how we improve and invest in the richness, cultural heritage and biodiversity intrinsic values of Australia and New Zealand as well. So let me take a step back. Before we get back into LEAP, I think one of the things that's come through really clearly in terms of all of the piloting processes and the experiences that we've heard so far is that there's a stage 0 before stage 1, which is really crucial to lay the groundwork to successful application of the LEAP framework. And there are a number of things that we've seen and that we're seeing and saying to clients that we're working with, which are crucial, like first principles in terms of beginning to really get into the detail of the TNFD and your nature-based response as well. It's almost like a little bit of a walk before you run, but also learn before you apply, I think it would be fair to say. And really there is value in doing a few things first before you get into the specifics of the LEAP framework. Very much understanding within your organisation where your knowledge gaps are and where they are not. Because I think, as we've heard from the other piloting processes so far, there is usually almost always a significant amount of knowledge, frameworks, policies, data points, existing compliance frameworks, existing risk management frameworks that will need to be brought to bear in terms of actually working through and applying the LEAP framework. So spending time to both upskill your own knowledge and understanding in terms of talking with other stakeholders, new pools of experts in terms of biodiversity and nature impacts for your business, but then also in terms of internal awareness raising and knowledge building across your organisation is really, really important in terms of a successful piloting process and a successful application of the TNFD framework in particular. Also understanding where that knowledge might be, even if it might be labelled differently already within your organisation, is really important. One of the key areas of focus for the TNFD has very much been that explicit focus on adopting a Venn diagram approach with the TCFD and with other existing frameworks as well. So very much what we're seeing is that there are significant opportunities to expand and not duplicate existing governance frameworks, policy approaches and business management approaches, which can be brought to bear, which are useful to build on as you go through the process. But there are also some opportunities and some necessities here around looking at whether it's third-party data providers or knowledge providers, or experts or independent scientific bodies or agencies that are worth engaging with, as you kind of bring in that new knowledge requirement to complement the existing knowledge requirement as well. So this is my before you leap, walk before you leap kind of message, I guess you could say, which is very much spend a bit of time to actually lay the groundwork for a successful piloting process, because it will save you time, energy, and also make the process a lot easier in the medium term as well. If we come back to the LEAP, and this is my attempt to fit a huge amount of information on one slide, so it is really busy and I apologise. There's a couple of things that I want to talk through in terms of V0.4 of LEAP, which I think are really useful points to highlight in terms of the practical applications of the framework as well. And which is really great to see that the TNFD Taskforce, and it's a real compliment to the consultation process that they've undertaken, that these issues are being reflected in the expanded design or the refined scope of the LEAP framework as well. And that scoping is very much an extension of what I was just saying. So very much that thinking around bringing in a lot of, or acknowledging a lot of the value that the financial institutions were seeing in that first scoping stage, and also providing some additional guidance for corporates in terms of adopting a similar approach. That there's, again, benefit to be had in terms of setting yourself up for success in really kind of understanding, in particular, what type of analysis would be most useful for you at this point in time. And there's a couple of ways to come at this, and again, which reflect the amendments to the scoping part of the LEAP framework. The first is very much that the pragmatic elements in terms of the type of organisation you are, understanding where your key interface points are with nature. Also understanding where your data is, and hopefully when you've walked before you've leaped, you have a really good understanding of where there might be some rich pools of data already available to you. But it's also, I think, really important in this version of the LEAP to have brought front and centre the importance of acknowledging stakeholder feedback and consultation and concerns as well. And I think this is really important because for many organisations, they will already be responding to queries, concerns, or engagement from stakeholders across their value chain. This will be coming from both the environmental civil society movement, from investors, from policymakers, from suppliers, from employers, from customers as well. So there are going to be some logical entry points and some helpful a helpful materiality overlay in terms of actually what do your stakeholders want you to be prioritising as you also apply the LEAP framework as well. So that kind of explicitly acknowledging that that necessity of actually bringing together the materiality, the data, and the stakeholder concerns, I think is a really important setup for an effective LEAP process as well. If we just move down a level into the actual the L, the E, the A, and the P, and again, that kind of locate element in terms of the interface with nature. So there's a few different elements here as well, which I think in the expanded version, or the version 0.4, are really useful. And then there are also some pragmatic considerations in terms of applying the LEAP framework. Again, the ever-expanding knowledge bank that the TNFD provides around data sources and data providers is really critical. But it's also worth acknowledging that many government agencies are also going through the process of mapping environmental data to emerging data user needs, including within Australia, and the Department of Climate Change, Energy and Water as well, is also going through a similar process of that data mapping exercise. And a number of state governments are also going through a similar process in terms of mapping existing data and compliance data requirements, for example, to emerging market-based needs through TNFD, for example. This is not a message to wait for those data sets to be complete. This is very much a think about the ecosystem in which you're operating and the data sources and the data availability and the stakeholder needs in terms of actually informing that prioritization process as well when determining your interface with nature. And I think we've heard that from the pilot processes that have come just before me in terms of what tools people have found useful, some of the constraints and some of the evolving design features around the data ecosystem in which we're operating. There's also an element of the pragmatic, as I mentioned before, which is very much, if you know your business, you will likely know where some of the most obvious parts of your impact and dependency assessment are likely to be, because of the work that you've done, the consultation that you've done internally, that are worthy of a really useful starting point, I guess I would say. So, for many different companies that we're working with, we're seeing that there's an awareness around potentially full value chain impacts and dependencies, but a useful place to start in piloting the framework is often with the obvious suspects in terms of becoming familiar with the process, becoming familiar with the tools, becoming familiar with the data sets, and building that, layering up that internal knowledge and awareness as well, and thinking of it as an important foundation stone for an expanding program of value chain and full upstream and downstream issues mapping as well. It'll be different for different industry sectors. Definitely use the industry sector guidance to help inform that. Thinking about your business footprint as well, so that that really kind of grounding yourself in your physical location is important, but also applying that kind of common sense pragmatic overlay of actually where our biggest issues likely to be. That's probably where we should start, even while acknowledging that those are the known knowns, that you will have known unknowns when it comes to actually applying the full TNFD process as well. So I think it's a pragmatic kind of lesson that we've learned from the piloting process so far, which we're encouraging companies in order to unlock some of that analysis paralysis that you might experience when going through the full TNFD framework as well. Again, when it gets into the evaluate and assess parts of the process, again, it's very much a question of thinking through company-specific, issue-specific areas and really thinking through existing risk management and risk mitigation and opportunity pursuit channels. So this should not be a means of creating a whole new separate standalone nature-based biodiversity framework. It's very much a question of, as we heard before, thinking through your experience and your knowledge in mapping Scope 3 emissions, thinking through your experience and your knowledge in mapping your supply chain for modern slavery compliance purposes, thinking through the opportunity investment strategies you might have in place for climate and for broader ESG issues beyond climate in the E of the ESG, and actually really looking at an integrated, embedded approach which allows you to capitalize on existing work and deliver it in an efficient and integrated and a strategic way, as well as in terms of bringing in a knowledge and understanding of new issues as well. I'm also really keen to promote, and I'll do this in a couple of different ways, the fact that version 0.4 has a lot of really useful additional guidance to work your way through in terms of the technical mechanics of how to do particularly the evaluate and assess, but also in terms of the prepare part of the LEAP framework. And there's a couple of things though that I really wanted to call out, which are at different points on the maturity spectrum of your biodiversity response as well. I think the first is that the target setting guidance, really clearly drawing those lines to the global biodiversity framework and global policy and emerging national policy goals as well. This is an infrastructure which has worked very effectively for climate, which is seeking to be emulated here. There will be nuances and difference in terms of how that translates in practical realities, but having that similar connectivity from asset to organisation to national to industry sector to global goals and ability to track progress and contribution towards those global goals is really important. And the additional guidance provided in the target setting appendix, which actually demonstrates or provides some more information on how to achieve that connectivity, I think is really useful in terms of translating risk assessment and opportunity assessment to strategic response as well. Similarly, the focus on disaggregating the disclosure metrics. I mean, Guy wasn't joking when he said that's the money slide in many ways, because what gets measured gets a lot of focus time and resources. And definitely having that understanding around the core metrics for global consistency and comparability versus sector-specific issues to reflect the particular impacts and dependencies of your industry or your key areas of activity, as well as the biome-specific, which again, it comes back to that stakeholder focus. Because for many external stakeholders, what they're looking for is how are you impacting a particular issue as well in the context of what's your impact on my local water system? What's your impact in terms of a particular area of rich biodiversity value that I care about? What's your aggregate impact as a company on the environment from an investment perspective? So that having that ability to work through the disclosure metrics from those different lenses is really important. And again, the scenario analysis toolbox, I suspect the scenario analysis toolbox is a little bit, it will take us a little while to really work through how we use that. And I think, again, that's a process of layering up the data systems, the frameworks, that first stage of the L and the E in terms of understanding where those core impacts and dependencies are. But it's important to sort of also look at the scenario analysis framework, because it gives you a sense of direction of travel as well, and what you're referencing and benchmarking to, which is always the value of a scenario analysis component as well. And then there is a lot more in terms of all of the tools and the appendices there as well. This is just my very unattractive snip of all of the different annexes, which are complete with the framework. Guy did say that there's a very deliberate attempt to push you through it in a logical way, but I would just say that in any one of the areas of the LEAP framework, there is no shortage of additional information to help you deep dive in particular areas, which I think is actually really fabulous, because most people tend to work through in a logical, systematic way. And this does provide you with the opportunity to kind of dive back and forth in the key elements, even as you go through the guided framework that the TNFD website is provided. And definitely all of those additional components for both financial institutions, but also corporates more broadly, in terms of working through the different elements of the LEAP framework. There's a lot more detail now sitting underneath it. And actually, I would say that version 0.4 has gone through a process simultaneously of synthesis and expansion. So it's streamlined the existing work and it's expanded the level of detail to allow you to implement it in a lot of ways as well. I just want to finish on a couple of key points around data and disclosure and risk. And there's a couple of things that have really caught my eye recently. The first is that within the TNFD and within version 0.4, there's a lot of emphasis on the differential between assessment versus disclosure, and that actually a large part of the LEAP framework is intended to help you understand your risks and embedded in your risk mitigation and management processes to understand your opportunities and to build out a strategic response to that before you get anywhere near disclosure. And I think that's a really key, useful differentiation, because it's not always helpful to start the process entirely from the lens of what am I going to need to report at the end of it, or to think about the going through the process with a view to how do I just respond to what people want me to report on, even though that's ultimately where you need to get to. Because I think if you take that approach, you don't necessarily get all the value of the analysis that comes through applying the LEAP process. Having said that, I would also just point you towards a very interesting and significant legal opinion that came out a couple of days ago in New Zealand through the Aotearoa Circle, which was produced by Chapman and Trett, which talks about directors' duties and nature risk. And I think in any kind of risk and opportunity identification process, it's always important to remember the core principles of directors' duties, fiduciary duty obligations, and disclosure obligations, in terms of understanding that if you are identifying in your processes material risks associated with your impact on or dependency to nature, then there is an obligation to manage those risks and to disclose to the market any financial losses that you may experience as a result of those impacts or dependencies as well. So in the same, and I mention that because in the same lens of thinking through climate-related obligations and directors' duties and obligations. All of that thinking, all of that kind of processing around core underlying legal obligations for both risk identification and disclosure, and management, I should say, will apply and do apply to nature. This is the first legal opinion that I've seen has explicitly stated it. It will definitely not be the last. But it just was an extremely timely piece of release that I thoroughly recommend you go and have a look at. Now, I don't want to put the fear of God up everyone and tell you not to do anything, because again, coming back to that point around the fact you need to start understanding these risks, because ignorance is no defense. And increasingly, as we see organizations working through the detail of the pilot, there is a huge amount of value to be had in learning from those experiences. And again, if you think about your own organization, if you talk to your internal stakeholders, there are always logical places to start in terms of the scoping of your first piloting exercise, and to begin to work through the process in a way that familiarizes you and all of your internal organizational stakeholders with the LEAP framework, and then allowing you to then increasingly expand it across your full value chain as well. And I think the next part of the RIA session, this is my about to hand back to you, Estelle, is very much intended to help in that conversation. The quickest way to learn how to do this is to talk to people who are going through the same challenges and questions, and to actually apply it to real world examples as well. So we've got all the infrastructure we need, particularly after version 0.4. We've got, I think we have all the detail that we need. There are things that are still evolving, but there's definitely a really practical approach to be adopted in terms of getting underway, and in terms of understanding your risks, and also being able to put in place an effective strategy to pursue opportunities and also contribute to the restoration of biodiversity and nature as well. So with that, I might hand back to you, Estelle, just to move on to the next part of the session.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Emma. And yeah, certainly that point about, not everything being done through LEAP is disclosed at the end. That analysis is really important to take away, and also the practicalities of sort of prioritising, becoming familiar with the recommendation and the tools in terms of starting to use the framework. And also your point about making the case, the importance of making the case on using TNFD within your organisation. We'll actually be covering that in our next workshop in June, which will all be about building the case for TNFD, bringing in an investor perspective, how it overlays with TCFD and global sustainability reporting, how it can be incorporated into existing reporting, and so on, and also how TNFD can actually be used to help track progress against how your organisation's aligned with global targets like the Global Diversity Framework, which is kind of like saying, being Paris aligned. So yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. Look, it's great to see all the conversations going on in the chat. Thanks to Guy and others who are answering questions in real time there. We've got about 4 minutes before we move on into the breakout session. So some very quick questions to our presenters, if you don't mind. First of all, to Justin, we've got a few from the mining sector with us online, but we also have a lot of investors here. So what are the opportunities for investors to get involved with and piloting? If you could just take us through.
Yeah, can you hear me all right?
Yep, gotcha.
Yeah, good question. At the moment, we're working a little bit with UNEP FI, who are running some of the financial institution piloting programs, and they've expressed a bit of interest to team up with some mining sector specific pilots to run a joint pilot. So I think if there is any specific interest from particularly financial institutions, there is an opportunity to potentially team up with some of our mining sector pilots to see how it kind of shows up there. I think on the other side is we're also looking to lift the capacity of our mining sector piloting participants in a range of different areas while they're piloting the program. And one thing we're quite interested in is how the financial sector or lenders are thinking about using the data that we'll be generating in disclosure to make investment decisions. So I think that there's a two-way education process that would be really useful. And so again, really happy for anyone to reach out to me directly. You'll find my details on the ICMM website. So yeah, please reach out.
Thanks, Justin. You can also we'll put you in contact. I was going to ask Paul as well, you know, we've got this massive focus on risk in construction and infrastructure. What would your advice be for contractors in commencing reporting on TNFD?
Simply, I think treat it as an opportunity. So I think view reporting of nature-related risks as an opportunity to enhance sustainability performance. I think my advice would be do a materiality assessment, so identify the risks related to your business, prioritize them, look at your current reporting practices, and engage with your stakeholders, so your board, investors, customers, regulators, to understand their expectations, and then also to integrate the TNFD recommendations into your current procedures, and in particular your risk and reporting practices as much as you can, and align those disclosures to your current reporting frameworks such as GRI and TCFD.
Yeah,
that would
great.
be my advice.
Yeah, it does strike me that you can kind of overlay TNFD onto TCFD, and it's pretty much identical, but with some additional recommendations in there to reflect the complexities of nature. Emma, I might just ask you quickly, we're hearing that companies are sort of reluctant to start in advance of TNFD 1.0 being finalised in September. Just here now in March 2023, what could investors reasonably expect of companies to be doing at this point?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think in any, yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good question, although to some extent the last 48 hours have potentially answered it, to be honest, because I think there is the argument that there is insufficient or still insufficient detail, or a number of core elements of the framework that are still to be decided, I suspect is now parked to a great extent, because the sheer volume of detail that's been provided in version 0.4, I think, addresses a lot of some of those issues that companies were raising in terms of ability to proceed. And I think you've definitely seen that from the piloting examples that we've had so far today as well, that it is entirely possible to get a pretty good understanding of where some of your material nature-based risks are going to be across your portfolio of assets, and to begin doing something about it as well. I think I would slightly balance that, though, with saying that that's not to say that for many organisations at the moment the fatigue is real. So there is a lot going on around all things reporting, disclosure, data gathering, investment management as well, and the agenda of ESG issues continues to expand. So I think what I would say for investors is what a reasonable expectation is very much, one, make sure that you understand the issues yourself when you're talking to companies, that you've actually invested the time to grow your own knowledge base, to understand what some of those key sectoral guidance frameworks are telling you around core versus sector specific issues, to very much correlate it to that materiality lens in terms of actually where are the key contributors to financial value that may potentially have a nature risk exposure or opportunity exposure, and also to be thinking around what stakeholder expectations are requesting and asking of companies at the moment around their key impacts in particular. Are there very topical or lively issues which you would expect from a broader ESG perspective a company to have had a response on already, and can they use this framework to actually reinforce or bolster the specificity of their response and how they're managing that response as well. So definitely all of those issues are at play, but the core answer to the question around expectation is know your risks and dependencies and begin that process in terms of the most significant potentially material parts of your business.
Great, thanks, Emma. And that's a good segue into one final question that's come through in the chat around the expected burden on small producers, and a question around not wanting this reporting shoved down the value chain. Guy, I'm wondering, are you able to comment on that one before we move into the breakout sessions?
Yeah, I saw the question, and if the tone of the presentations is troubling, I'll take the rap for that, because it's pretty early here and it's been a really busy week, so apologies for that tone. I think the most important point is that we're expecting with the TNFD that the burden is actually being shifted in the opposite direction, that a lot of the knowledge and the information across many different sectors, sits, with those small producers and people who are most connected to country. In the case of agriculture and food, a lot of farmers have this information already, are actively managing natural resource as kind of active stewards, but the information hasn't been recognised or taken up by those within, say, financial institutions or corporate level. So what we're actually seeing, in the stakeholder engagement we've done, is that particularly for food and agri, that a lot of those producers have that information, are actively able to kind of share it, but it hasn't been asked by their investors. So a lot of the burden is actually shifting in the opposite direction. They need to build the capability and the understanding and the systems to take on board that information. And so, we were obviously really keen to hear otherwise. The other key point is the stakeholder engagement process. When we talk about stakeholders, it's not just shareholders, it's also others that are providing that information. And it's really clear in the framework that stakeholder engagement process happens early and throughout the process. And where there are hurdles, where stakeholders, producers within the value chain can't provide that information, then it's recognized within the stakeholder engagement recommendations in the framework that burden is taken away from those who can't provide that information, that you're not continuing to press and push. And so that's another really important point that I didn't discuss in my introduction, is the stakeholder engagement recommendations does recognize where that burden may be unfairly shifted down the line, and how that can possibly be addressed. So yeah, really good question.
Wonderful. Thanks, Guy. And thanks so much to Emma, Justin, Paul, and to you guys for your incredible insights. We are going to stop recording now.